Hello, 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 NaNoWriMo. I am Grant Faulkner, Executive Director of NaNoWriMo, and thank you for joining us for this special Double Up Donation Weekend webcast. We have a lot planned for you, some great writing conversations, and I wanted to ask people if you can post in chat where you're from, maybe a word count update, anything you want to say about your writing, just to get the conversation going. I know that these webcasts usually have two big strains of conversations. One of them is me with authors, and the other part is you, which is like so wonderful to read the chat and all of your contributions to the ongoing conversation about writing. And so this is a big day because it's day 4 of NaNoWriMo, and I'm going to give you a little peek behind the scenes of NaNoWriMo. I was on social media, and it's so great to see people's word counts and see their successes and just like think about this kind of, I don't know, galvanizing momentum of the world writing with you and how that can carry you along. But there's a second story to that. And a lot of people actually on day 4, this is when some people drop out or begin to think about dropping out. It happens earlier in the month rather than later. And Kwame has the perfect expression for that. And here's the deal, I think here's what happens is that sometimes people fall behind, and even after 2 or 3 days of falling behind, it seems really daunting to catch up, and so they feel, maybe bad about themselves. Sometimes life intrudes, and that just happens. And then sometimes I think people's enthusiasm for their story wanes, and sometimes people even start to they don't believe in themselves as writers, or they don't believe in their stories. And I just want to repeat NaNoWriMo's mantra that your story matters. And it's really important to think about that and think about why your story matters and to believe in yourself, because novels really get written by belief more than anything. And I look forward to hearing our authors today talk a little bit about more about that. But I hope, I always say make NaNoWriMo work for you. So if you've fallen behind and you can't catch up, don't quit. Just keep writing, even if it's 100 words a day. So just keep it going and let the momentum come back to you and try to finish out the month. So that's my general advice, and we'll go further with that. But I want to talk a little bit about Double Up Donation Weekend. We have a challenge to write 150 million words, and we have a challenge to raise $150,000 for NaNoWriMo. And so reporting out on this, we've raised $37,068. Thank you so much to everyone who donated. That's huge. And we have reached a word count total of 37,230,286 words. So we're for every million words, we're getting $1,000 in donations. So I want that I'll be monitoring that pace throughout the weekend. That's great. So today we have 3 fantastic middle grade authors here with us today. And this is giving me a pause to think about why people should donate to NaNoWriMo. And one of the reasons I think is our Young Writers Program, which a lot of people don't actually know about. But one thing that makes me proud about it is I was a very writerly, bookish kid, but I never once thought about writing a novel when I was a teen. I didn't really think about it until I was well into my 20s. And I think that this is a fantastic gift that the Young Writers Program gives kids and teens, is that I'll talk to some 16 or 17-year-olds, and they will have written 5, 6, 7 novels. They might have self-published some of them, like they're writing and actively writing and part of a writing community. And so we have I think about 90,000 kids and teens and teachers who've signed up for it, and we're in about 10,000 classrooms. So if you want to donate for the cause of writing and creativity, that's a great reason right there. So, but I want to get to the conversation with our authors today. And so to kick things off, I'm going to introduce each author. And after I introduce one author, I'm going to ask that author to tell the story of how they became a writer, when they realized they were a writer or decided to be a writer. So I'm going to start off with you, Claribel. Put on my glasses. Claribel Ortega is a former reporter who writes middle grade and young adult fantasy inspired by her Dominican heritage, and she's a New York Times bestselling and award-winning author. When she's not busy turning her obsession with 80s pop culture, magic, and video games into books, she's co-hosting her podcast, Bad Author Book Club. Claribel is a Marvel contributor and has been featured on BuzzFeed, Bustle, Good Morning America, and Deadline. Thanks for joining us, Claribel.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so I'm curious, when and how did you decide that you wanted to be a writer or that you were a writer?
So I've written since I was very young. I think I didn't really decide, like life decided for me. Um, I would write sort of short stories, lyrics, poems. I was one of the kids who would write books for my family members as presents and like put them together and make a little cover. And then the first book that I ever wrote, actually, an idea for a book came to me before I decided I wanted to be an author. It was sort of like the story came first, and it was like that throughout my whole life. So, right after college, I got my first like book idea, and I started working on that. And uh, then I was like, how do I get published? And I had to do all the like research part of it, but it was sort of the story was always first for me. And then I sort of decided after that, like, hey, I want to do this forever. And let's see how I can make that happen.
That's so cool. Thank you for sharing that, Claribel.
Sure.
Kwame Mbalia is a husband, father, writer, a New York Times bestselling author, a former pharmaceutical metrologist, and a publisher with Freedom Fire Books, an imprint of Disney Hyperion. His debut middle grade novel, Tristan Strong Punches a Hole in the Sky, was awarded a Coretta Scott King author honor, and it, along with the sequels Tristan Strong Destroys the World and Tristan Strong Keeps Punching, is published by Rick Riordan Presents Disney Hyperion. He is the co-author of Last Gate of the Emperor with Prince Joel Mackinnon from Scholastic Books, and the editor of the #1 New York Times bestselling anthology Black Boy Joy, published by Delacorte Press. He's a Howard University graduate and a Midwesterner now in North Carolina, and he survives on dad jokes and Cheez-Its. So we have basically the same diet, Kwame.
Pretty much. Pretty much.
How and when did you decide you were a writer?
I think there were two occurrences. I mean, what I tell young readers when I go on school visits is that I've been writing since maybe like third or fourth grade. But I only did it for myself. I did it for an audience of one. There was one reader who was reading it, and that was me. And I wrote because talking was disgusting. I was incredibly shy. Like, I didn't want to talk to anyone. If I had to communicate, I would craft letters, write notes. Like, talking was just, it was too personal. I didn't feel that. So I've always written, and then I would slowly start to share my stories. And it wasn't until maybe 6 or 7 years ago on Reddit, I think, when we did a kind of a writing group, I should say. And somebody DM'd me and was like, I would pay you to read more of what you wrote. That was the very first time I was like, you can get paid for writing stuff? I mean, I was in my 30s. I was like, you can get paid for this here, things that I just imagine up and put on the page. Imagine that. And so that's what just like sit me down, the pipeline of how do you become an author, finding an agent and sending work in and doing all that sort of jab, way harder than just writing for little old me, but also more rewarding knowing that I could reach additional readers and viewers, and especially young people out there who had stories that they might want to tell as well.
That's so interesting. Here's to the power of the internet. This person who told you to be a writer.
There was a 2-month period where we interacted, and then they disappeared into the void somewhere. So I don't even remember what their screen handle was, but random, Reddit user from Germany who would show up at like 6 p.m. my time to encourage me to write because you wanted to read it. Thank you so much for everything that you've done.
I hope you dedicate a book to this person.
Your pillow is always cold.
Well, our next up is MarcyKate Connolly. And MarcyKate Connolly is a New York Times bestselling children's book author who lives in New England with her family and a grumble of short-nosed dogs. I'm going to use that word to describe
It's such
dogs.
a great word.
It's a really wonderful word. I have a grumble of one short-nosed dog, actually. She graduated from Hampshire College, a magical place where they don't give you grades, where she wrote an opera sequel to Hamlet as the equivalent of a senior thesis. And it was also there that she first fell in love with plotting and has been dreaming up new ways to make life difficult for her characters ever since. That's a key to plotting, is to make life difficult, right, for them.
Indeed.
Yeah. So when, where, how, why did you decide to become a writer?
So I liked to write poetry when I was younger. I was a big Emily Dickinson fan and wrote lots of ripoffs of Emily Dickinson growing up, but I didn't really think of myself as a writer. I kind of wanted to be like pretty much everything else. I went through a phase of wanting to be like an archaeologist. I want to be president for a brief period of time. My favorite was I wanted to be a farmer who lived in a motorhome and had like the animals tied to the back. All kinds of things. Writer
All great
wasn't
options.
on the list. Yeah. Then I got to college and I wrote an opera, and then I was like, hey, I can write, like, I can do stuff, but I didn't write the words. I wrote the plot and I really enjoyed that. And I wrote the music, but the words were actually all Shakespeare's plays and kind of pulled out of context and then Frankenstein back together according to a plot of my own devising, because it did not occur to me that I could actually write the words. I don't know why, it just didn't. Later, after I graduated college, I pretty quickly realized that operas were really not an effective way of paying off my massive student loans. So I got into arts administration and was getting my master's degree, so I could work for arts organizations. And during that time, I was commuting from New Hampshire to Boston and then working during the day and getting my master's degree at night. So that's like a 2-hour commute because of the traffic. I wasn't really sleeping, basically. And it was one night, I'm trying to get home. I'm stuck on this train. And if you've ever been in the Boston subway, the subway, they tend to stop just like randomly between stations. And you're just kind of like in the dark waiting, especially like at the worst possible time when you're trying to get somewhere. So it's late at night. This train is just stopped between stations and it's an old subway system. So there's lots of random unused tunnels. And there was this old unused tunnel nearby and I was at the window and it had this plastic sheeting and a light behind it that was glowing in this like super weird way. And I'm totally exhausted and my brain is just going every which way. And I'm like, that would be really cool to write a story about fairies living in the subway tunnels of Boston. And that was like the idea. And I was like, that's really interesting. And I went home and I wrote the first page and the first chapter and then the next chapter. And I just kind of totally fell in love with this idea. I was like, well, if I can write opera, maybe I can write a novel. And I gave it a try. And I did finish the story eventually. And I just loved it and kind of haven't looked back.
That's an amazing story. I'm going to advise NaNoWriMo writers that when you get stalled in your plot, please get on the Boston subway and hope
It's
that
a great
it stops
place to get story ideas
somewhere. Yeah, or something similar to that. You can get story ideas in the weirdest of places and at the weirdest of moments. Yes. Well, my first two questions actually come from one Sarah Mackey, one of my NaNoWriMo staff people's children, and they have great questions here. So her daughter Eleanor asks, how do you come up with ideas that are kid-friendly if you write for grown-ups a lot, or just if you're a grown-up? How do you write for kids? Is it all right if we start off with you, Claribel, for that one?
Sure. So it's really funny, but I don't really when I get ideas for a book, the way that I decide like who is a story for, who the protagonist is going to be, is really sort of the journey that my character is going to go through and sort of like the voice that I first hear my character speaking to me in. And it just so happens that they're usually 12. It just so happens that the ideas that I get just sort of fit into the middle grade space. I have written young adult books before, and it's kind of the same thing. Like I come up with a plot, and that plot sort of like dictates, like, okay, who is this going to be for? Is it going to be something that a middle grade kid can relate to, or is there going to be themes that maybe are for kids that are a little bit older? So my story really dictates like if it's going to be for kids or if it's going to be for teens. I don't write for adults, so I don't have that problem yet. That probably makes it easier for me. And I've never had to sort of like age down or up an idea. It's always sort of like just worked out. And I think it's because those are the kinds of books that really made an impact on me. So when I think of story, I think of adventure, I think of middle grade, and that sort of like magic of what I felt the first time I started reading like longer books and really getting lost in books the way that I still love to today. So I would say the way that I make sure that it's age appropriate or that it sort of fits into what other kids are reading is I read a lot of books. I read a lot of the new books that are coming out. I'm lucky enough to be reading Kwame's new book right now. And it's excellent. But just reading what's current. I think a lot of times if you're just getting into writing and you're not a big reader, I think it is important to sort of see what the landscape looks like. What do books look like today? Because they look very different from when we were kids. So I just try to keep up with what's current, what kids are reading, what kids are watching on television, music that they're listening to. I kind of have to keep abreast of all of these things to really be able to still relate to them.
That's great. You'll eternally be 12 to 14 years old or so.
I hope so.
Kwame, how about you?
I would actually love to piggyback right off of what you just said of eternally being 12. I think for everyone, even as we age, there's always for some, it may dwindle faster or be smaller than others, but there's always that spark, that same spark that you had when you were a child, when you were a young reader, when you were 12 or however old. And it sticks with you, and you kind of, there's certain things that kind of trigger that spark when you interact with it in the world. For MarcyKate, it was, that stalled, subway, and seeing and then getting that what if idea. I love that MarcyKate gravitated to fairies and not well, fairies can be equally as terrifying. Let me not
Yes, they can.
feed into this mythos that has cropped up around fairies that somehow they're not terrifying. I would like to dispel that judgment. Fairies have gotten away with way too much for way too long, and I, for here, am on the we need to reveal this mystique around fairies. Anyway, let me get off of that soapbox. There are like 20 soapboxes in my office. You'll stumble over them when you come inside. For me, it is if you could not have told yet, I am the biggest child ever. I still have the maturity level of a 12-year-old, and I think that's why I kind of gravitate towards that. Potty jokes are amazing. They will never go out of style. And so for me, I've tried to write several adult stories, and I think they would make very good adult stories. It's just that they would oftentimes make better children's stories, because so Claribel hears the voice and she goes character first, if I understood what she was saying earlier. For me, it's different. For me, I'm a plot first person. I see something and I'm like, that would make a great plot. Like, what if, what was that movie? Waterworld with Kevin Costner. We could make that, but for 12-year-olds. You know what I mean? Because I think that would be really cool, right? And now I'm like, okay, what character fits the plot that I'm trying to go for, right? And so for me, it's like I will see scenarios. I'm like, oh, that'll make a cool story. Maybe like there's a spaceship captain. He's an adult and he's whizzing around and it's all cool. And he's making first contact. That's amazing. And I'm like, yes, that's amazing. But if it was middle grade, it would be even better. Imagine a middle grade character made first contact. We would all be doomed, unless sometimes maybe not, depending on the decisions that they would make. Imagine like trying to come up with an intergalactic translator, and the very first person you interact with is like my 12-year-old. Like, the slang that she's using is not going to be relevant in a year, right? And so aliens are just going to be perpetually confused. And it just makes the obstacles and the difficulties that much more interesting, in a way that sometimes adult books, I don't, adults, we're too cynical sometimes. We've had a lot of the luster and the wonder rubbed out of us, just worn down. And so sometimes it's refreshing to go back and view what a challenge or an obstacle or a story would be from the eyes of a middle schooler or a 12-year-old.
Yeah. Do you have anything to say about that, MarcyKate?
Yeah, I think that's kind of hitting the nail on the head, is that idea of wonder. I think in middle grade, there's more wonder than there is in adult books and even YA as well. There still is in YA, but just there's this innocence to people. And even if they've had and there's not to say this is not difficult topics in middle grade, there absolutely is. And it's perfectly appropriate to cover them from a middle grade lens. But there's just a different way of looking at the world. For me, I kind of stumbled into middle grade. I actually wrote what I thought was a YA book, and I wrote several YA books, and the one that got me an agent and then got published. We thought it was YA, we pitched it as YA, and then the publisher said, hey, I want to buy it as middle grade. So it was a bit of I had to figure out, okay, is this really middle grade? How do we make that work? What do I have to do to make it middle grade? And I kind of just immersed myself in middle grade and reading everything I could find to kind of get a sense of that. So it's not something I necessarily consciously think, is this middle grade or is this YA? It's the idea and just the whole vibe of it kind of tells me this is middle grade now. It didn't before. It was a lot more of a intellectual exercise for the first few books of figuring it out. But it's kind of become second nature now, figuring out, is this YA, is this middle grade? And sometimes I'm wrong, and that's fine. If someone says, no, that's not really middle grade after all, like, okay, I can fix that.
We should maybe, I was just thinking we should maybe tell viewers, because sometimes people get very confused about what middle grade is and why. No, I just thought it'd be helpful. And also to think that these are marketing categories for publishers. So for NaNoWriMo writers writing your story right now, it's something to worry about later if you want to get published. I think I'd advise people just to tell their story and not get too worried about categories. But MarcyKate, maybe you can answer this since you went through it. What's the difference between middle grade and YA?
It's, in my experience, it was certain things were age appropriate and were not. And most of the book, my first book, the main character had this sort of sense of wonder in looking at the world. And that's kind of, I think the best way I could describe it was just her way of looking at the world was a different viewpoint. And it was a younger viewpoint. And most of the story was in that way. And then I kind of at the end in my original manuscript had sort of like a massive thing happen in the end. And then there was some not age appropriate things for middle grade happening. Fine for YA. Those had to be basically removed and replaced with a sea dragon, which was way more fun. Made the book 100 times better. Also ended up making the book like expand by like 20,000 words, but more sea dragon. It was great. Or sea monster rather. It was great. It's just kind of that. It's hard for me to describe, but it's that sense of wonder. But I think, like Claribel was saying, immerse yourselves in middle grade books if you're not sure, and you kind of absorb that, and you can tell that distinction better. But like you said, Grant, don't worry about it right now for NaNoWriMo. It doesn't matter. Even if like you think it's YA or middle grade now and it turns out it's not, you can fix that and change it later. Like if you think it's YA and you go out with it and nobody buys it, you can take it back, take a step back if you're getting feedback and say, maybe this is actually middle grade, and revise, revamp, and maybe take it back out as a different category. So it really is for a place for it to live on the books, in the bookshelf and the bookstore. So
yeah. I'm just gonna remind people, I think people are already putting their questions in chat, but in about 10 minutes or so, I'm going to turn it over to viewer questions, and we're going to try to get through as many of those as possible. So Catherine's already sending them to me, so please put your questions in the chat windows. And this next question is not a trick question, I don't think, but it comes from Sarah's daughter Lucy. But it takes some pondering, I think, maybe a moment to ponder. Do you write lots of kinds of books or lots of the same kind of book?
Ooh.
I had to personally think deeply about this, and I came up with I think I write lots of the same kind of book. I'm not sure what that says to me. Maybe I should be more adventuresome. Can I start with you, Kwame?
Yeah, sure. That's a great question, and I would say that kinds can mean a lot of things. So for me, it means genre, and then the through line, the kind of the character arc, the character story. So I had those two definitions of is it a science fiction, is it a fantasy, is it a contemporary? In which case I would say yes, I write lots of different kinds of books. But when we talk about the story, the through line, and the growth that the character goes through, I see a lot of similarities in my stories and what the character goes through. And in most cases, it's a young boy who has suddenly realized that the world is greater than he thought it was, that it was bigger than he thought it was, and he has some power to influence some things in this world. And he has to grow to understand what his power can and can't do. And I find that is similar in every story that I write. There is, even, you know, in the cases where I have to write nonfiction, or cases where I've had to started to write, you know, my unpublished adult fiction, somewhere in there, there's a memory, there's a flashback, there's me, myself, talking about myself as a young boy, realizing that the world is bigger than what I imagined it to be. It's no longer my house or my neighborhood or my community. You know, it's my state, it's my city, it's the people that live within it, the demographic that live within it. And so in that case, I kind of write the same kind of story. And I think that is such a great question. That is such a very wonderful way of looking at how we write.
It is, yeah. I mean, I've heard people say that a lot of authors have essentially published one book and then they've done variations of it the rest of their career, and that is intriguing. How we get kind of fixed on a single kind of idea or storyline that we need to figure out. Claribel, how about you? Do you have anything?
That's where I just want to. Yeah, that's where tropes come from, right? Where we get this idea of there's this repeated kind of action or thought process or story mechanism within a story, right? And we recognize it. And some of us are like, oh, we've seen that before. And some people are like, oh, I've seen that before. And then some people are like, I need that. I've seen that before, and I know I like it. And so we kind of write that same type of story over and over because it's comforting for us.
Yeah, exactly.
To read and to write.
Claribel, how about you? Do you have a take on this?
I sure do. So I'll give you an example. So I wrote a series called the Witchling series, and it's about, you know, 3 misfit witches. They're spares. They don't fit in anywhere. And I always say, like, why are my readers so chaotic? Like, they're these 12-year-old kids who are very intense, very chaotic, very funny. And I'm like, oh, it's because they're kind of like I was at that age. They seem like they're like the witchlings. And it's because the things that I write are a reflection of who I am, right? So my books tend to, be similar because they're taken from my life. They're taken from my experiences. They're taken from my personality. When people ask me sort of like, are any of the witchlings based on you? I will say, well, they're me at different points of my life. Like they're me. One of them is me when I was much younger. One of them was like angry teenager me. One was like current day me. I put everything that I write is me in the story. So I think it makes sense that my books are all similar, that and I always tell writers who are trying to sort of find their audience, just write the things that you love, and your readers, the people who are like you and have things in common with you, they will find it, and they will be the ones that devour those stories, right? Because we always have things in common with other people. So just make your books a reflection of like the things you love, the stories that you like to read and consume yourself. And we all have, different preferences when it comes to that. So I think it really does make sense that our books are all sort of like one book and remixed. I would say for sure, I think all my characters are the underdogs. It's been my experience. And I write a lot about feeling left out as a diaspora writer. I think I can really sort of relate to that as a child of immigrants. Someone who grew up in the South Bronx, like very poor, I had to sort of like struggle to make my way in the world. And so when I write a story and I'm being very vulnerable and open, which I think is kind of what it takes to write a good story, then that's what ends up coming out. The things that are true to me, that are deep within my heart and that I've had to struggle with. So, yeah.
Sarah, I'm so glad you mentioned that what makes a good story is an author being vulnerable. Because that's my premise, and I think it's something for NaNoWriMo writers to think about, is that I love how to write books, I love writing workshops, I love all that stuff, I love the craft of writing, but all those how-tos, in some ways, it is just about being vulnerable and true on the page, which is easier said than done sometimes, but it's something good to focus on, I think, during November, is to honor that, and that can drive your story. And MarcyKate, since you're wearing a NaNoWriMo t-shirt, I want to ask one question before we move on to the viewer questions, just about, NaNoWriMo's premise, which is, to write with abandon, banish your inner editor, just to get the words on the page.
Mhm.
And sometimes, I think people have this concept that once you've made it, meaning once you've published a book, that your inner editor just goes away permanently, and that you can just write books with ease. Or, Kwame's getting wide eyes there. But do you still have an inner critic? How do you deal with your inner critic? How have you dealt with your inner critic? Assuming that you've had one for your whole writing career.
I definitely have an inner critic. It's my worst critic, that's for sure. It's something that I think it's hard to deal with at first, especially when I was unpublished. That was when it was the worst, because that every rejection you'd get from an agent or it would feel like, oh, that's just because I'm a terrible writer. And querying is not quite what we're talking about with NaNoWriMo, but once you get to that point, it's really hard to take that rejection, but you have to build a thick skin and figure out how to do it, because it's a part of being a published writer, and it's hard. Rejection is not fun from anybody. But while you're doing NaNoWriMo, it's the time to forget about that as best you can. And that's one thing that I love about NaNoWriMo, really, is that it's just a sort of breakneck pace. And I actually am a person who normally hates drafting. I love revising. I take like that raw material and make it like shiny and wonderful. But I love NaNoWriMo because I think there's also my inner competitiveness. I look at like my peers and I'm like, ooh, they've got to 5K. Maybe I can get to 5K. And it kind of gives us motivation to like keep drafting and keep going. It's also usually I have that story idea I've saved up all year and I'm really excited about, that I finally get to write. So there's that extra excitement for me about doing this. It took me several years of doing NaNoWriMo. I've been doing it since like 2009. Didn't make the last 2 years because of kids, but before that, had a good stretch, had a little break. Now I'm back. And just sitting your butt in the chair. That's what you have to do, is just sit down or walk on a treadmill desk. I have a treadmill desk instead of a chair. One of those things. Stand at your standing desk, yoga ball, whatever, in front of your computer, and put those words on the page every chance you get, and block that as best you can. It's hard, but you have to figure out how to do it and just keep your head down and keep those blinders on as best you can.
Blinder is a key metaphor.
Yeah.
Kwame or Claribel, do you have anything to add about your inner critics? Critic plural, critic singular. How do you deal with it?
I mean, I get enough from my editor during my edit letters, so I try to be kind to myself. I'm the kind of person that I get an edit letter and I like won't read it for 3 days because I'm so scared to see what's in there, and my editor will be like, just open it. So because I'm getting feedback from all these other people in my life already and like scary trade reviews, I try to be really gentle with myself. I make this running joke that I've been making for years, that I write my books in Wingdings 3, and like it got to the point where BuzzFeed nearly did an article on it, because like it went semi-viral saying that I did that so that I wouldn't go back and edit. It's not true. Between us, I've never done that. But I just try not to reread. I think that is like sort of the thing that can keep you stuck. Just going back to reread every day. Oh, let me catch up on what I wrote. Like, no, just sit down and write, because if you do that, you'll get stuck in a spiral of trying to make it perfect and second guessing what you wrote. And I think it's smart and good to give it your all and really make the book the best that you can. But at a certain point, you got to let it go. And I think I've learned how to deal with that throughout the years, where I'm just kind of like, it is what it is. I did my best. I did my absolute best, and everything else is up to the readers. And I try to keep that mindset and just have fun with the story and be kind to myself and be gentle with myself, because I'm already contending with all of these other things in publishing. So it doesn't really serve me to be so hard on myself when it comes to criticizing my writing. That's
so great. It's a practice. It's an ongoing practice and discipline to keep that inner critic out. It's really nice to hear. And Kwame, I was joking with Kwame before we started that when I first talked to Kwame on our Right Minded podcast, he had this thing where he'd say, drop and give me 50, meaning 50 words, but somehow my brain also interprets it as 50 push-ups. And I'll see him do that on Twitter sometimes. And you also told me, I think that was a way for you to keep writing during the day, by asking other people to drop and give you 50 words. So does that help you like deal with the inner critic as well?
I came to grips with the fact that my critic is going to be with, you know how you have those two little, you know, angel and your devil on your shoulder, like feeding you, you know, you should do this, your conscience, you do this, no, you shouldn't do that. I have editors that sit on my shoulder and they're like, that's not the right way you use further, you should be using farther, or it's lay instead of lie. I've come to grips with it, and what I tell when I talk to young writers and young readers and they're asking me, you know, for their writing advice, I tell them that you are going to be your first gatekeeper that you encounter, right? You're going to be the first person that decides whether or not something happens by, you know, am I going to sit and write today? Am I going to submit to this magazine? What if they say no? Well, by not submitting at all, you've already answered that question, right? So like, you're going to be the first blockade that you face. And so if you can deal with your own inner critic and inner editor, I'm not going to say it makes it easier, but you find ways to navigate and move through. So for me, you know, the coming up with the drop and give me 50, to make sure that, you know, people would stop and write 50 words. A lot of times all people needed was just that little push, that little bit of motivation, that little bit of community engagement, saying there's other people out here who need help to get that motivation to write as well. And so, yes, when I would tweet that out, you know, I would sit down myself and try to write 50 words. And each and every time, it never stopped at 50 words. It may have stopped at 100 or 200. Sometimes I just kept going, and then I would remember, oh, right, I got to check the replies and encourage people. The biggest thing that I learned is that writing is such a solitary endeavor, you know, in most occasions. It's not like, you know, TV or, you know, where we're writing in a writer's room or anything. A lot of times we're just writing with, you know, it's me, myself, and my personalities, right? And so we're all sitting down trying to get this manuscript written. Knowing or having some sort of community engagement to encourage me and push me along, which is why I love that NaNoWriMo kind of brings us together and encourage us to do this at the same time. Knowing that there are people out there who are further along in their career, who have not started in their career, who are just now thinking that writing is even possible for them, bringing us all together and just being like, hey, right now is like, okay, let me write right now.
Cool. That's so great. I'm going to switch to some viewer questions here from Caitlin Nisnik. Asks, how do you make sure that the main character's voice and experiences are appropriate? I'm not sure exactly what she means by the word appropriate, but I think could view it as a general kind of characterization question, I think. Not sure whose turn it is, but I'll toss it out there to you all, whoever wants to answer it.
I'm assuming they're talking maybe age appropriate for like writing for middle grade.
You know what? I think you're right. Yep.
Claribel, you look like you were about to speak. I'm going to kick it over to you. I'm going to punt it to you, Claribel.
Oh, sure. I mean, I think it kind of goes along with what I was saying before about just knowing what constitutes like middle grade nowadays and like keeping abreast of it and knowing what other books, what's happening in other books, and just really understanding the genre and studying it. And I mean, if you have kids in your life, it always helps to sort of like pull from that. I'm a 5-time tia. I like to say I have 5 nieces and nephews, and they are great material for like sort of knowing what kids are going through today. And just if you read a lot of books in the genre, especially a lot of current books, you will be fine in terms of like knowing what's okay to put in there and what's not. I think sometimes asking other writers, especially if they don't write or read middle grade, can sometimes be a mistake, because I think people assume like, oh, that's too scary, that's too deep, that's too sort of like complicated, and they underestimate what middle grade kids can handle. And it's usually a lot scarier than anyone else thinks. Like the scarier, the weirder it is, like the more they love it. Like they love weird stuff. So I think that's important to keep in mind. And I think the weird stuff that they like is just like getting weirder as time goes on as well.
I was going to say, Claribel, I'm not sure if this was a middle grade book or a YA book, but I think Ursula Le Guin had one of her books had a long history of rejections, and all the editors said exactly that. They were like, the kids, this is too scary for kids, and of course that was wrong.
Yeah, I think kids love to be scared and they can handle it in a book. And what better way to prepare them for like the horrors of life than like a safe book where they can just like close it when they don't want to read anymore. But like my favorite books and movies, like Return to Oz, horrifying. I loved it. It was one of my favorites. Like anything that was like really, really creepy when I was younger, I was obsessed with. So I just try to sort of like recreate that when I can.
Yeah, that's great advice. MarcyKate or Kwame, if you have any takes on this, how to write age appropriate characters?
MarcyKate.
I was gonna say I think Claribel's exactly right. I mean, I think there's often a thought in other people who are not necessarily middle grade writers that yeah, you can't be scary, you can't be too weird, and that's just utterly not true. Like my first middle grade novel, there were like 12 deaths in that book. Like some people died twice. Like I hear it all the time. You can't kill people in middle grade. Absolutely, you can. Appropriately. Like it doesn't have to, like, not gruesomely, obviously, but like people can die. They need to. This happens to kids in real life, and they have to deal with those ramifications, and all sorts of things happen to kids, and they need a safe place to digest that, understand that, and to be able to walk away if they need to. They can't do that in real life, and that's one of the wonderful things that books provides. So that's my thought. I don't think there's much that's really off limits necessarily in middle grade, but perhaps to make it more appropriate, have them off page in some ways. But by lots of books, you'll figure that out.
Speaking for my former middle grade self, when I was like a 14-year-old, all of the books and movies I saw that were not age appropriate for me were the most meaningful works of art that I've to this day experienced. So yeah.
And
any final? I'll go ahead, call me.
Yeah, just to piggyback off of what MarcyKate was saying, just to reemphasize, like a lot of what will, I feel like, make that determination is what you put on the page and what your descriptions are. Like, obviously, you know, there's a big difference between someone dying and someone dying graphically, and how you describe it, right? And so like those differences can often determine what, you know, publishers or marketers will decide, you know, where it's appropriate to categorize your book. Because a lot of times I've read books with 12-year-old characters, and I've read books that have been classified as an adult, and it's just all about what you put into, you know, or how you describe the book and how you use those words, whether you're alluding or whether you're just, you know, showing.
Mm-hmm. This is an interesting question, this next one. Do you try to put messages in your stories, or what is the one strand in your story that keeps you centered and that you need when you write your story? You know, is it a message or a feeling or whatever? I like the whatever. What is it that keeps you centered in your story and driven for it? Guess I could go back to trying to mix things up here in order. How about you start, MarcyKate? I don't think you've started yet.
That's a really interesting question. I think it depends on the book, because each book is a little different and the inspiration for each book is a little different. I don't necessarily put a message per se in a book, but I think it's kind of the character, I think, really is for me what keeps me going, and the character and whatever that thread is that really inspired the book initially. Like some of my books are inspired by other books, or by like the Boston subway thing that was never published, and that was a good thing. And you know, my nano book that I'm writing right now, it was inspired by the warring libraries of ancient times. So like digging into that and doing some research and pulling that inspiration as kind of a through line through the book. It's more the inspiration rather than a message. I guess that almost sounds like they're asking, are you like trying to be preachy? But I don't think that's quite what they mean. But that's kind of like how it feels to me if I were to like consciously put in a message in the book necessarily. And that's not a good idea to kids' books, because kids catch on to that and they don't like that. They will really pick up on that and they will close your book.
Kids are just like us.
They are. They're smart. So you can't write down to them, I think. But I think the things that I like about it are kind of the weird things. I like to say that I like weird. I like to write weird books. All of my books have a thread of weird in them, because I was a weird child who was not popular. So that was what I like to read. So that's what I like to write. And that's kind of what pulls me through, whether it's a character or a plot point or inspiration or whatever that happens to be.
That's great to identify that, I think, because I think that knowing that as being the central core of your book or your purpose of writing can help you, get through those tough moments. Do you have any take on that, Kwame?
Yeah, I think I actually I'm on both sides, right? So on the one hand, I don't for most books, I don't, try to put a message in it. What I'm doing is I'm just writing about my culture and my lived experiences, right? And so if I'm writing about, the African diasporan culture or African American culture, history is going to be included in that. Tristan, is heavily based around the Mid-Atlantic slave trade, although the monsters appear from the horrors of the Mid-Atlantic slave trade. So it's hard not to infer a message from that. But there was no intent to go down to, hit people over the head with history. There was the intent to tell a story and have that as the backdrop, right? On the other hand, we did intentionally set out to write a book about joy and preach about joy and share joy. That's how Black Boy Joy came about, is we wanted to show that side of the neighborhoods and the communities and share that with the world. When the news cameras and the headlines have disappeared from whatever tragedy, we wanted to come in with Black Boy Joy and say there's also happiness and joy and community gathering at all times throughout, and we want to share the whole story. So that was a message book. That was a message about joy, and that was intentional. So it's interesting. I say that I haven't, and then I say that I have, but I think in both circumstances, how you go about it, how you go about spreading or talking about that message is what makes the difference.
Claribel, what is it that keeps you centered in your novels? What centers you?
I think it's a couple of different things. I'm usually trying to answer a question. I'm usually trying to explore a theme, and I'm also trying to get a character from point A to point B. So I will know where my main character needs to be at the end of the book, who they turn into. So I'm sort of thinking as I'm writing, as I'm planning it out, what needs to happen to my character throughout the course of their journey to become the person that they're going to be on the other side. And then for Witchling specifically, I can use as an example, the question that started the book was, what would happen if the sorting hat put you nowhere? And I wanted to sort of explore that, what if you didn't belong anywhere? And then that led to themes of monstrosity and sort of who is considered a monster and who is not in our world, and who gets away with committing monstrosities under the veil of sort of polite society. So I think one thing often leads to another when it comes to writing, but those are the three main things I would say: character, a question that I'm trying to answer about the book, and the themes that I'm exploring. Those are the things I sort of keep me centered and help me to finish the book in a way that I'm not veering off course.
That's so great to hear from all of you. I'm going to ask part 2 of Queen Jay-Z's question. What should I consider when developing voice for middle grade versus YA? Is there any special consideration? I think I'll just toss that out there for all of you to think about.
Voice is such a and there's for me, there's two types of voice. There's the voice of your character and then the voice of your story, right? The voice that your story is written in. I mean, if it's first person, sometimes those can be the same thing. If it's third person, those can be different. The developing the voice of your character is it's almost personal, right? It's almost like you are trying to develop this individual personality that has to stand out among millions and billions. And sometimes that's your experience. Sometimes it's what you observe. Sometimes it's what you witness. Sometimes it's a lot of trial and error too. For me personally, I have sort of the middle grade voice that I use, but it's very generic when I'm doing my first drafts. And then there's the person who is that character, that's that main the main character of the story. In revisions, I go back and I'm like, what makes this person unique? And a lot of times it's what have they lived through? How were they raised? um, what have they, what are their beliefs, and what have they encountered, right? Like someone who you're going to have a totally different voice from someone who is like a middle child in a giant family who feels like they're not often heard and they shrink and they're quiet and reserved amongst themselves, versus maybe, someone who is loud and boisterous and domineering, a type A personality. Like, they will have two totally different types of voices, even though they may go through the same exact plot of a story. They may speak about it and encounter it and visualize themselves going through it differently. So voice is something that I feel like every author is going to have a different way of coming up with their character's voice. And I don't think any of them are wrong. None of them are wrong. It's just, how you create that unique character, how they're speaking to you, and how they're speaking to the readers.
I'm glad that you centered that question in character, Kwame, because the question was about these two different genres, middle grade versus YA. And I think like steering it towards characters really the great way to do that, right? Not to write for the genre, but to write for the character in your story. I don't know if anyone wants to contradict that or add to that.
I think Kwame said it all.
Okay. Thank you, Kwame. Well, Claribel, I have a question for you. We're nearing the end of the hour, and I started out by saying that actually, strangely enough, day 3 or 4 is when a lot of people drop out of NaNoWriMo, and I want to talk them out of that. Actually, I want to give them reasons to keep going. And I saw a TikTok video that you did that I thought was really interesting, because there is part of NaNoWriMo that is this kind of no pain, no gain. Wake up every day and write your 1,700 words. And I think that can be it can be great, it can be very motivating, but it can be very daunting, and sometimes I think people get kind of worn down, or there's too much pain and they're not feeling the gain. And so I think like there is part of NaNoWriMo that you want to make sure that you're having fun. You want to make sure that you're getting rewards. You're going to want to make sure that you're feeling good about your story. And you in your TikTok video talked about a NaNoWriMo-esque event, which was Finish Your Book Fall. Mm-hmm. And you described it as a gentler version of NaNoWriMo. So I was wondering if you could kind of speak to that. Like if you've signed up for NaNoWriMo, how do you keep going in a gentle way?
Sure. So first of all, Finish Your Book Fall is a little bit longer. So you'll have, if you get to the end of November and you're like, I didn't finish, you can keep going till December 21st. So you have a little bit more time. And I think what writers should keep in mind, if they're doing Nano, if they're doing Finish Your Book Fall in conjunction with it, is that you win if you write. Like, you have more words at the end of it, or even more of a better idea of your story, right? Because sometimes writing looks like deleting and daydreaming and thinking about your story, not just getting words down. If you have a better understanding of your story, if you have more words at the end than you did when you started, I consider that winning. I think that you've accomplished so much, because it can be so difficult to just get words down. So I think writers can sort of look at it through that lens. Do I have a better understanding of my story? Did I get some more words down? Yeah, maybe I didn't completely finish it, but I'm on that path. I'm in the thick of it, which is like the funnest part of it for me. Like being in the thick of writing, getting started can be so difficult. So just as long as you get started, it doesn't matter when you finish, but just keep going. And I think that beginning is really, really what is so great about Nano, especially because all of these writers are starting at the same time. There's really this like momentum and this push. But then if you don't quite get to the point that you wanted to, you can keep going and write at your own pace, but at least you have the basis of a story. You have the beginning of a story. You have an understanding of your story, and that is enough to celebrate, in my opinion. And, I think also a big part of it is community, making community, meeting other friends in the writing world. Nobody quite understands what we go through except for us. Like if you tell somebody like, I wrote 10,000 words this week, they'll be like, is that good? And you're like,
yeah, is that good? I love that.
Another writer will be like, oh my God, that's amazing. So having people who, get it who really get it. I think that is the best part of it. I think community for me is always the best part of writing, of being in the book world. You meet so many people, you get to commiserate about the highs and lows, and events like this really foster that. So that's what is important to me.
I love that. You win if
And
you write.
staying hydrated.
Stay
Take care of
hydrated.
yourself.
Yeah, you win if you write, and that's the message I want to give people these next 26 days and beyond. If they do always forget the name of it. Finish your book fall.
Finish your book. Yeah.
And Kwame, that made me think, like, with your drop and give me 50 words, like I remember when we first talked about that on the podcast, part of that is that when you write 50 words, you can write more words. And part of it was that kind of like, if you win if you write, you seize this tiny pocket of the day, because sometimes you might only get 5 or 10 minutes to write, right? And I think you brought that up in the context of you being a working dad.
Yeah, I mean, it started off because I worked full-time, parented full-time, obviously, and then wanted to be a writer. So I was like, where do you find the moments to write? For me, it was like those, you would find those pockets, right? And then those pockets would go past, and you'd be like, oh, I could have written that. And so that drop and give me 50 was like a moment to like utilize those. All right, I just put the pot on to boil. I'm standing right here in the kitchen. The toddler is occupied with something that's at least going to take him about 7 minutes to figure out. I have 7 minutes. What can I do in 7 minutes, right? I can't load the dishwasher in 7 minutes. I can't mop the floor in 7 minutes. I can write. I can write in 7 minutes. Is it going to be a lot? It's not going to be a lot, but it'll be more than I had if I didn't write, right? And that's what, with Claribel, with Finish Your Book Fall, and with NaNoWriMo, and what we're all trying to push is that at the end of November, on December 21st, or after you've written 50 words, you're going to have more words than what you started with. That makes you a writer.
That's so cool. And MarcyKate, on this subject, I think one of the challenges that a lot of people face when they do NaNoWriMo is time, and finding the time. And I think a lot of people sign up and they don't realize they got to make time for their novel. You got to make time in the world for an hour or 2 hours a day. And so how have you made time for your writing?
That is probably my biggest life challenge presently, because I have a day job. I have 2 small children, which is why I wasn't able to do NaNoWriMo the past couple of years. But this year, I've made that commitment to do that. And I was afraid for a little while I wasn't going to be able to, because my day job's supposed to be part-time, and it's been masquerading as full-time for the last few months. Finally, now back to part-time. And I'm putting on my work calendar, blocking out time. I am putting that on there and holding myself accountable, saying this hour here, I'm going to write. This is my time. And I have it on my calendar, so my colleagues know that I'm not available, which is good. And taking every time that I can. I really relate to the toddler thing right now. I have a 2-year-old. It's like, if he's engaged, 5 minutes, write something down.
I have a really good mic with nice isolation. That's why you can't hear him sprinting outside of my office, because he's very loud. He's very active. We're in prime toddler time right now.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, I have a 2-year-old and a 6-year-old, and they're both little boys, and they are little boys. They are wonderful, and they are a lot. And it's hard to find the time, but you have to like literally make the time, carve out those moments in your day. And it's hard. It's not easy, but if you love the writing and you really want to do it, that's what you have to do, is hold yourself accountable to those times. And I think with NaNoWriMo, it's great to have that community, like Claribel was saying, because you have other people who can help hold you accountable, or help you even find those moments of, what are you doing right this second? Can you write on your phone if you're, doing something else? Can you write on your phone, on your computer? It's a challenge, but I know when I was commuting to Boston and working and full-time and going to school at night, I didn't have a lot of time to write, but I wrote on the train, or I wrote while waiting for the subway. And it was like every minute I could find that I wasn't doing something else, I would be writing. And that's just kind of what you gotta figure out how to do.
MarcyKate, I hope you're going to donate a lot of money to the Boston subway system. It seems very important to your
Only
writing.
if I ever rewrite that first book and get it published, maybe,
Okay. Well, how about in closing, if each person can give one bit of advice to go onward with for participants to kind of keep writing for the rest of the month? I know we've already talked about things, but just your favorite bit of advice that you'd like to send people off with. Claribel, can I start with you?
Sure. So one thing that I've learned about myself when it comes to writing a book is that on the days where I would sort of sit down and be like, I have to write 5,000, 10,000 words, I would get so stressed out that sometimes I would do nothing. So I came up with this saying, and it's gentle consistency over rigid discipline. And it's sort of giving myself enough flexibility that it's okay if I don't get a huge word count that day, but I will eventually finish the book if I sit down and write something and I'm gentler with myself. I don't demand so much of myself, but just sitting down to do anything that I can, even if it's 5 words, even if it's 50 words. So be gentle with yourself, gentle consistency, and that book is going to get done and you're going to have a better time doing it.
I like that. Gentleness can work for you, even with big word count goals. How about you, Kwame?
I have 2 calls to action for you all. The first is if you're in the chat right now, find someone and just maybe exchange an email or a social media handle, right? And check up on each other. Like, hey, how's that coming? How's that YA novel coming? How's that middle grade novel coming? Have you solved that one? Sometimes the biggest motivation for me comes when someone else is excited or interested in what I'm trying to write. And that gives me the motivation, like, oh, someone's looking for the next chapter. Someone's wondering what's going to happen next. Let me keep writing. We get so kind of self-defeated sometimes because we don't know, again, because it's such an isolated occupation writing is. That's the first. And the second is I like to use pacemaker.press, but you can use any kind of Scrivener does it for you, where you can set a date and kind of like calculate how many words a day you need to write. And I don't do it, to be like, all right, I got to write 2,000 words today to have this ready by a deadline. Sometimes I just like to say, if I wrote 100 words a day, and only taking the weekdays, not including the weekends, how long would it take me to write a 50,000 word book, right? And a lot of times the answer is you're still within this year, right? You're still within a year, 200, 250, right? How long would it take me to write a book of this length if writing this many words a day? And all of a sudden I'm like, I could write a book this year if I only wrote 200 words a day. You tell someone that and they're like, no. You tell an author that they could have a book a year writing 200 words a day, someone who's published before, we would take it in a heartbeat. 200 words a day and I have a book ready at the end to hand to my editor? Absolutely. 100%. So I like using any sort of calendar, any sort of word tracking app. I use Pacemaker. Scrivener will do it as well. I'm sure there are other apps. You could do it in Excel if you wanted to, or Google Sheets. Any way that I could say, how long would it take me to write this book? Only writing this many words a day. Again, being gentle and consistent with yourself.
I love the moments where writers discover math and the 200 words a day, 72,000 words a year. It's amazing. Like the first time I realized that, gosh, I was a middle-aged man. I was like this, Anyway, how about you, MarcyKate?
I have to say, I second the Pacemaker Press and Scrivener. Both amazing tools. I love Scrivener. I used to teach workshops on Scrivener. Huge fan. Love it. There's a discount with NaNoWriMo. That's how I first got Scrivener. It's great. I have 2 tips. My first one is coffee or caffeine. Lots of caffeine. That is kind of how I survive NaNoWriMo, or anytime I'm under like any kind of writing crunch for a deadline. Which I need more of because I'm sorry I've been yawning. I apologize. It's coffee o'clock here. Second, go to write-ins. And I'm saying this as like a huge introvert. I am very socially awkward. But going to the in-person write-ins is so helpful in finding other people who are in the very same boat as you, who are struggling just like you are to meet that, 1,700 words a day. And you're all doing it together. And it's this wonderful sense of community. Again, even if you're an introvert like me, it can be so helpful and so motivating. For like many days later, just going to these write-ins and meeting other writers who are also as socially awkward as you are, most likely, and doing this together. It's a wonderful opportunity to find community. And I highly encourage that. I know I have found that extremely helpful for me.
Well, thank you so much to all three of you. I just want to part and tell our viewers to keep writing. That's the number one thing we want you to do. Keep writing, go to write-ins, help your fellow writers keep writing, all that is so important. And help us, reach our 150 million word count goal as of tomorrow at midnight, and also help us reach our fundraising goal of $150,000 over the weekend, so that we can keep putting on writing events and keep having wonderful webcasts with wonderful authors like this. So thank you so much to all three of you, and thank you so much to all the NaNoWriMo writers out there writing. So I'll see you in Nanoland.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks so much.